I recently read Hannah Murray's memoir, The Make-Believe, and it was the best memoir that I've read so far. 5 stars, hands down. It was filled with so much insight into her bipolar disorder and her manic episode that turned into spiritual psychosis. So today I'm going to walk you through all of my thoughts on the book, all the while telling you a little bit more about what the experience of bipolar disorder is like, what triggers manic episodes, and the psychology of spiritual psychosis. So I just got into reading memoirs pretty recently this past year, and one of the qualms that I often have with memoirs is they're often written by people who don't use the full power of language to its full extent. And this was absolutely not the case for Hannah Murray's memoir. She seems to be like an incredible writer. Like the very first scene, it's written in such a lyrical style, we are immersed in her magical thinking state of mind, with little glimmers such as naked as Eve, I want another baptism, but the heaviness of the psychosis is balanced out by the beauty of the prose. We're really given an insider view into the way her tangential thoughts are sort of strewn together in her mind. She has such a gift for recalling sensory detail and knowing what words to use so that the reader also experiences that detail. Like when she writes, the scent of smoke from prop cigarettes hung in the air, a mixture of marshmallow root and rose petals. Everything fake was sweet, it seemed. Syrupy blood on the side of my face, sticky like the hot night air. My purple paisley dress was soaked in sweat, but there was a rack of identical dresses on the costume truck like a cartoon character's wardrobe. This memoir was so beautiful from a literary standpoint that I almost wasn't sure whether to post this review on this psychology channel or on my book channel, Book and Hearth, which, by the way, so many people messaged me on Book and Hearth to let me know that they didn't know that channel existed. I've had that channel for like 2.5 years at this point, so if you're interested in all things book reviews, spooky season, romanticizing life, definitely go follow me on there. Alright, so let me tell you a little bit about what happened to Hannah Murray. You may know her from her character in Skins or from Game of Thrones. She's a pretty famous British actress, and so the memoir starts when she's filming on set for the movie Detroit. An acting coach encourages her to open herself up to let something come through her in an almost shamanic way. She starts trying to do that, so she stays up all night and she feels herself starting to become more emotive and open. Put a pin in that because sleep-wake disturbances are definitely a red flag of bipolar disorder. So on set for Detroit, there's a moment where she has to act out basically an essay, and she finds it very difficult to not feel traumatized and violated by it, even though it is technically, acting. And despite the fact that the cast is trying to be very kind and accommodating, but she even starts having nightmares about it, and it becomes so distressing for her to the point where she starts to see an energy healer. Up to that point, Hannah has dealt with a lot of difficult experiences: disordered eating, self-harm, a difficult relationship with her parents, a former abusive relationship. She also describes herself as being obsessed with 5 ghost siblings from her mom's previous miscarriages, so she has a lot of survivor's guilt regarding that. She's 27, and at this point, she identifies as a militant agnostic. She also heavily experiments with drugs, which, as we'll talk about again in a moment, is not really good for bipolar disorder. But at this point, she wants to turn her addictive personality into something more constructive, like spirituality. So the offer of spiritual healing feels almost like a drug deal to her. So she goes to see this Reiki healer, and she genuinely starts to feel the magic and to feel the healing happening to her. And at this point, she's also in a friend group that really likes to party. She herself is heavily binge drinking and having anonymous sex at the club, and she becomes particularly fixated on sort of like a friends with benefits. It's like a friend that she's romantically interested in, that she has a sexual encounter with, but is constantly sort of breadcrumbing her. I wondered if she might have a disorganized attachment style because she wrote at one point, I generally fixated on people I could not have and was repulsed by anyone keenly interested in me. Around that time, ironically, Hannah goes to a Kanye concert. I say ironically because Kanye himself is allegedly diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and at the Kanye concert, she finds herself in a state of euphoria. The way she describes it, it kind of sounds like she's experiencing something called oceanic feeling. Oceanic feeling is the state of like oneness and euphoria that you experience when there's like very moving music playing with people, such as at concerts, in church, or also people tend to experience it up in space when they're looking down at Earth and they feel this sense of like, wow, I am so small in the grand scheme of things, we are all one, and I just feel like love and euphoria towards all creatures. Oceanic feeling is basically what Katy Perry seems like she felt when she went out into space. I thought it was kind of unfair that, a lot of people were mocking Katy Perry for that, saying that it seems like she was on drugs. That is a very textbook, typical experience to have when you're out in space. It's also called the overview effect, which is when you have like an overview of the Earth and you suddenly realize how small and petty any issues that you have with other humans may be and how important it is for us to save the Earth and for us to all be unified. And both of these concepts, oceanic feeling and the overview effect, are also related to something called collective effervescence, which is what religion relies on. It relies on music suddenly starting to move people and people feeling this like elevated state, this like almost spiritual state of euphoria where they can physically feel God in them. But really what a lot of it boils down to is very moving music and experiencing it in tandem with a bunch of other people. So I don't think it's a coincidence that Kanye, another celebrity with bipolar disorder, created an environment of heightened emotionality at his concert to which Hannah found herself very susceptible. Because as we'll get to a little bit later, mania begets mania. Not that it's like contagious or anything like that, but once you start to experience those very elevated emotions of early mania, it can quickly spiral into something more serious. She's told by one of her healers around that time that her third eye is very open, that she was very open-minded and receptive at that moment. The way that I sort of interpreted that was that she was very suggestible in that moment, because when people are experiencing powerful emotions, they are very easy to influence. That's why, for example, when someone hears a very shocking story that makes them really angry in the news, that's when they're most easy to manipulate by propaganda. Hannah describes a good amount of like purple sky imagery in her meditations and visualizations, and I thought this was really interesting because this is something I've encountered before. I've read different spiritual books that claimed purple is like an enlightened color, and I also heard, when I was a therapist, clients of mine who would meditate, and they said when they started to reach a very deep state of meditation, they would start to see purple on the backs of their eyes. And this brings up a really interesting question. Is that just because certain mental states have a neurochemical effect that causes us to see purple? Or does purple reflect a state of spiritual openness and enlightenment? This is exactly one of the themes that I explore in my upcoming dark academia thriller, The Splintered Parts. By the way, it's coming out August 14th. If you plan on getting the ebook, you can pre-order it now. And doing that really helps me because it makes it more likely that once the launch date releases, all of those pre-orders go through and I'm more likely to make it to the Amazon bestsellers list. But all formats, including paperback and hardcover, will be available on August 14th if you prefer a physical copy. Link in the description if you're interested to know more about the novel. So after a while, Hannah starts to experience decreased energy, lots of tearfulness, low appetite, an urge to self-harm. She's smoking heavily. It basically sounds like a period of depression following a period of maybe not mania, possibly hypomania, which is like a slightly less intense version of mania. She feels basically addicted to the high that she experienced during the hypomania, and she's kind of like having a come down from it, because as I'm always talking about, what goes up must come down. And one of her friends at this time actually catches on to the up and down fluctuations in her mood. So Hannah writes, "One morning when I was just leaving a session with my therapist, my friend Emily called to say she was worried about me. She said she had noticed I had been very up and down all year. She said she knew I did lots of things to take care of myself, exercise, healthy eating, meditation, therapy, but she thought the problem might be something bigger, something that required a different kind of help." As it turns out, Emily is pretty much the only person throughout the memoir who actually sees the warning signs of bipolar disorder and tries to help Hannah. But Hannah continues to go deeper and deeper into this spiritual school that she's become a part of. She's taking more and more courses from them, and signs of mania start to come back. She experiences, for example, delusions of grandeur, where she says, "I am God." She wakes up super early, despite the jet lag, which makes it more likely that she would wake up late. She starts doing spontaneous cartwheels. She says, "I felt so much higher than I had ever felt on cocaine." Her mind is buzzing and she can't sleep. She sleeps for 3 hours and wakes up feeling completely rested, energized, and excited for the new day. She's overspending a lot on magical objects, all of which are textbook symptoms of a manic episode. And then she meets a man high up in this spiritual organization called Steve, and this is where things really start to take a turn. But before I go into that, a quick quick word from today's sponsor, Beducated. One of the themes in today's video is how vulnerable we are when we turn somewhere for help, and that place turns out to be more exploitative than helpful. Well, Beducated is a great place to turn for help and information if you feel unfulfilled in your intimate life. It's very informative, shame-free, grounded in research, and created by real professionals. It's a platform with over 150 online courses on sex and intimacy by experts in their field. They have a huge amount of variety: tutorials, practical exercises, inventories to check in with yourself. They contain something for everyone, whether you're single, in a relationship, dating around. Beducated has something for everyone. Let's say that you struggle with confidence in the bedroom. You can take this course called Confident Lover by Haneen Khan, where you can learn to let go of pressure in the bedroom, boost pleasure by connecting with your body, understand and navigate your unique sex drive, communicate openly about sex with your partner. The modules include redefining sex, getting out of your head and into your body, knowing and loving how your sexuality works, bringing creativity into your sex life, and making sex conversations light and joyful. This is just one of so many valuable resources on Beducated, because remember, physical intimacy is a skill, not a talent, and like any skill, it can be learned, practiced, and eventually mastered. Click my link below to get started with Beducated. So back to Hannah Murray's story. As soon as Hannah meets Steve, she feels as though she's in the presence of a magician, and she very quickly becomes attracted to him. This reminds me of a study that I read a while ago on erotomania, which is when people become obsessed with a person who has like high status or power, and they also become convinced that that person has romantic feelings for them. So the study that I'm thinking about showed that people who experience a sudden attraction to someone when they're in a very emotionally elevated state, such as mania or substance abuse or something else, sometimes go on to develop erotomania, because things seem more meaningful when we are experiencing very powerful emotions, like in a manic state. In a manic state, the emotions are super heightened, so of course everything's going to feel more meaningful. Your attraction to some random guy who calls himself a magician is going to feel more meaningful and more magical. And in fact, a lot of what Hannah narrates does seem to fit in a bit with erotomania. So at this point, her mania starts to get pretty intense. One time in the bathroom, Hannah's telling herself positive intentions in the mirror, and then she decides to baptize herself in the bathtub and convinces herself that the only way I can really purify myself from evil is if I stay under the water until I drown. And at that point, she starts hallucinating Steve's voice. He's telling her that she's amazing, that he's so proud of her, almost like she's externalizing an internal voice from within her, something that she unconsciously wants to hear. She's sort of externalizing the intentions that she was telling herself in the mirror. In the context of everything that we know about Hannah, her body image struggles, her self-esteem struggles, her somewhat invalidating father figure, it all makes sense, especially because she mentions feeling comfort and safety when she learned that Steve is a dad. She can almost recognize her unconscious deep desire for a father figure. And she even says at one point, "But Steve is my father and I do want to fuck Steve." There's something very Freudian about this, of course. The Oedipus or Electra complex is not necessarily about sex from a psychoanalytic perspective. Sex is just kind of desire on crack. So in a sense, when Freud was talking about the Electra complex where a woman is attracted to her dad, what he really meant was that a woman was coming to terms with her deep need for the opposite sex. The Oedipus/Electra complex is honestly one of my least favorite things about psychoanalytic theory, but to defend it for just a moment, it's not necessarily about like sexual attraction for your opposite sex parent so much as it is a deep desire for approval and acceptance from them. The romantic sexual overtones in the complex just serve to enforce how incredibly powerful that need is, because like I mentioned, sex is desire on crack. Something else that you have to understand is that auditory hallucinations are a lot more common than visual hallucinations, despite the fact that they're sort of less stereotypical when we think of psychosis. The majority of people who experience a psychotic break, they're not actually seeing, different people in their room. Most of the times they're just hearing things that aren't really there, not even necessarily voices. It could be, the sound of like a faucet dripping. It could be something very rhythmic and non-human. So at this point, the prose starts to become more detached from reality. She does a really good job of just putting us inside the mind of someone who's unraveling. She thinks Steve is controlling the weather for her. She feels as though she's giving birth through the top of her skull. She's experiencing paranoia and persecutory delusions. She says, "We are being watched. They are on alert for signs of our love. We must be careful." During the psychotic break, she experiences a lot of hypersexuality, which I found to be interesting. Hypersexuality during psychosis can sometimes be a sign of SA history, where perhaps the SA even triggered the psychotic episode. Allow me to explain what I mean. A few weeks ago, I saw this TikTok pop up that was like a police body cam footage of a woman who seemed to be having some sort of psychotic break as well. And as soon as the police officer tried, very appropriately putting her in the back of the cop car, she behaved in what was a pretty hypersexual way where she started screaming, calling him a creep, saying he was trying to SA her, all these different things. And the moment I saw that, I thought, oh my God, I wonder if this woman has experienced sexual trauma. And as she continued talking, I learned that yes, she likely had experienced it because she started to reveal that she was having flashbacks of what her father had done to her. And so in Hannah's case, she's pretty upfront with us about the fact that she felt traumatized by the essay she had to enact on set of Detroit. That's kind of what started her entire journey into spirituality. So it's quite possible that that may play a role in some of the hypersexual nature of her psychotic episode. But I will also mention that it's not atypical for people experiencing a manic episode to also experience hypersexuality, because mania is by definition a lot of energy directed out into the world. Sexuality is also very high energy, very libidinal. So Hannah is having a psychotic episode in the bathroom after one of the spiritual courses she's taking, and she will only speak to Steve. Somebody brings Steve over and he tries to perform an exorcism on her. She then runs out into the street. The police is called. She resists, but they take her into the police car to section her, which I think is like the British way of saying to hospitalize her, to send her to inpatient, to residential. Even as this is happening, she thinks she's a magical creature like a mermaid, an angel, that she's going to save the world. She thinks that the cop car is a chariot taking her to marry Steve. Her sense of time and perception are quite skewed. Psychosis, psychedelics, and death all have a very similar effect on perception. This is again something that I kind of touch on in the splintered parts, even though it is a work of fiction. We see the main character, Soraya, actually researching this specific topic. Like, listen to this excerpt from Hannah's book. I'm staring at a tree, a living, breathing tree. The wind is dancing in its branches. It is as if I have never seen a tree before. It is as if it is the first tree of my life. And it is. This is not too different from how I've heard people describing trees on psychedelics, where they feel like it's almost like buzzing, like the trunk is like vibrating with energy, like they can see that it's alive. At this point, Hannah also is experiencing delusions of omnipotence. She's saying things like, anything that can be imagined, I can perform it. And over the course of her time at the hospital, she slowly starts coming back to lucidity, but not really completely. She actually starts texting Steve, who tells her that she was possessed, and he even tells her that yes, he was communicating with her through her mind. That's fucked up. As I expected he would do, Steve sort of deflects responsibility. He says, directing your anger toward the lineage or me or anyone is simply wrong. No one anywhere did anything to you. This happened not due to humans doing things, but energies. If you got sunburned on the beach, would you point at the lifeguard and blame them for it? Hannah writes, when I read these messages now, I feel sick. I feel disgusted at his shamefaced denial of responsibility, at his patronizing tone. But that morning in the hospital, I read them and I laughed and I cried. To be honest, I'm a little bit conflicted on this one, because on one hand, no one did cause her to have bipolar disorder. And when people experience spiritual psychosis, while there are definitely things that can make it worse, like certain spiritual practitioners taking advantage of them or misusing AI can bring on a psychotic episode, it's not really those things causing the psychotic episode. A person develops a psychotic episode because they already have that predisposition towards it. There are just certain things that can make it worse. But on the other hand, there are predators out there who will take advantage of those who are already vulnerable because of mental illness, who will take their money and lead them down an irresponsible path that's very likely to make their mental struggles worse. And if someone is in a manic or psychotic state, they're no longer able to take care of themselves, they're no longer able to give informed consent. So it's kind of like taking advantage of a child or someone with a severe mental disability. And so at that point, it's not about personal responsibility anymore. At that point, if you take advantage of someone extremely vulnerable who's not in the right state of mind, you kind of do have some responsibility for that. So Hannah gets out of the hospital, but even then, she's still talking to Steve. She's not quite 100% back to reality. She's still attending these spirituality courses. She's still overspending, but slowly she starts to recognize the delusions for what they are and to see that Steve is a little bit sus. She says a small crack had formed. Still, she pushes down her doubts because of the sunk cost fallacy, basically, because she's invested so much in this person and she's invested so much in the belief that there is magic in the world. And then she eventually comes down from the mania and she falls into a depression. Remember again, what goes up must come down. Mania can feel euphoric for some people, but the dysphoria that follows is just as extreme. And at one point, Steve ghosts her. He just stops responding to her text messages. She's still depressed 6 months after discharge from the hospital, and her psychiatrist suggests putting her on a mood stabilizer and a low dose of an antidepressant, and this seems to help her quite a bit. She gets back into dating, sex, work, and she says currently she's no longer spiritual, but she does see the magic in the mundane. There is magic in my life still. It was always there. That is how the story goes. You go on a journey, a quest, in search of something that was inside you all along. You just couldn't see it until now. I still cannot always see it. I do not live at the pitch of miracles every day, but sometimes often, my perspective shifts and I'm gifted with a glimpse of infinite treasures. Standing at the kitchen sink, I peel beetroots to roast for a salad, and they stain my fingertips magenta. The color is vividly real. I am alive. This is so beautiful and so true. You don't need to escape to a world of beauty and magic outside of the one we inhabit. The one we do inhabit is beautiful and magical enough. And I think this ability for people to see the world in full pigment color is sometimes one of the most beautiful aspects of people with bipolar disorder and other disorders that make people experience heightened emotions, like for example, even personality disorders. It's why so many amazing artists, like Hannah Murray herself, create such beautiful, pigmented, rich art, in this case in the form of a memoir, because they're able to see things a little bit deeper. They're able to feel things a little bit deeper than the rest of us. Also, did you know that she studied at Cambridge? Hannah Murray is one smart cookie. I was a big fan of both Skins and Game of Thrones, but I didn't really like her characters in either of them. Imagine my delight when I discovered watching her in an interview that she as a person is actually so lovely. She seems just so warm and humble in the interviews. But anyway, that's a summary of what happened. Now let's get into the nitty-gritty of the psychology, starting with the psychosis. And first, let me differentiate between mania and psychosis. Mania is a state of very elevated emotionality and energy that is a component of bipolar disorder. Bipolar disorder contains episodes of mania and episodes of depression. Psychosis is when a person is no longer in touch with reality. Extreme mania can result in psychosis, but not all mania is characterized by psychosis. There are plenty of people who experience manic episodes but never experience what's called a psychotic episode. You could also have something like schizoaffective disorder bipolar subtype, which is a mix between bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, where you do experience manic episodes and depressive episodes, but you also experience psychotic symptoms outside of the mania as well. So like even when you're no longer manic, you are still, for instance, experiencing paranoid delusions or something like that. So let's talk a little bit about spiritual psychosis. Steve told her that magic is real in a time when she was already beginning to untether from reality. It's the same as like when people say AI psychosis. It's not that spirituality caused the psychosis. It's not that AI caused the psychosis, but these things can make psychosis worse or can trigger an episode that was already bound to happen. It's kind of complicated to parse out causality because people who are already heading in the direction of losing touch with reality are more likely to be drawn towards things that trigger and worsen their symptoms, like conspiracies, magical thinking, cults. Hannah sort of touches on this when she talks about how she has always used magic for escapism purposes, to cover the mundanity and the pain of life. In all these things I saw escape, whether into magical fantasy or religious devotion, escape from the pain of being me. The landscape of my young mind was marked by deep, dark moods, terrifying existential angst, and torturous self-loathing. I dreamed of being someone else, teenage witch, Catholic convert. I wanted spells and prayers that would fix me and solve all my anguish. Now, something that I sort of alluded to before is that there are people who will take advantage of those who are already heading down the path of psychosis. For example, Hannah mentions that initially when she meets with that Reiki healer, the healer withholds information about what exactly she does until Hannah makes herself vulnerable, sort of lays bare everything about herself psychologically. Predators do this because they want to learn what makes you tick, what wounds they can press on. Once they know that information, then they know, okay, how can I best manipulate this person? So they're not going to tell you anything about themselves until they know how to weaponize your psychology against you. And it's interesting because even with Steve, different people in the school of spirituality catch on that he's a bit manipulative. One of Hannah's friends actually refers to him as a dodgy used car salesman. But in that state of becoming untethered from reality, you can't really tell. You can't really know when you're being manipulated as easily. And that is the very insidious aspect of spiritual predators, is that they will weaponize that lack of insight that people have and bleed them of their money and get whatever they want out of them. Let's talk a little bit about psychotic delusions and why the ones that Hannah experienced are sort of the main types of psychotic delusions that people do experience. So during a state of psychosis, there are certain very common types of delusions. One is grandiose, such as delusions of omnipotence, like when she says, I am glowing and golden, I am making this place glow. It often takes on very religious imagery and overlaps with religious delusions, like this belief that you are a prophet or a messiah or an angel, or that other people are devils or demons. And this is because religion takes grandiosity to the extreme. Religion speaks about good versus evil, the exact type of black and white thinking to which people who are experiencing psychosis are prone. And so that's a lot of the reason why people who experience grandiose delusions, they're often very spiritually charged. Another category of delusions are persecutory. Delusions of persecution, where you think that other people are out to get you, that your partner is cheating on you, that some powerful entity is monitoring you, that people are implanting thoughts into your brain, which is where we get the sort of tinfoil hat stereotype from. Again, this plays in with the black and white thinking. Some people are all good, some people are all bad. Some people are out to get me. I am the idealized entity, other people are the devalued entity. And another category of delusions is delusions of reference, which is when you think that the world or the universe or other people are sort of sending you messages through, say, a TV show that's playing, a song that's on the radio, a thought that you're having. Like Hannah writes, every tiny piece of information I received from anyone in those days could be a breadcrumb of significance, a potential message or clue that might lead me somewhere important, such as her belief that Steve was communicating to her via her auditory hallucinations. From a psychodynamic perspective, each of these types of common delusions serves a psychological purpose. For persecutory delusions, it is theorized that this is a form of projection, where a person is not aware of their own aggressive impulses, so instead they project that onto others and think others are out to get me. I thought it was interesting at one point, Hannah describes how she's meditating and she's being guided to listen to messages from entities. And she says she doesn't like that part of the meditation because it felt like I was making it up. I thought that was a very lucid thing to catch on to because that meditation is essentially a form of projection. It's tell us what God is telling you, but really it's what you're telling yourself. You are projecting yourself onto God. In my opinion, humans create God, not vice versa. What about grandiose delusions? What are they about? Grandiose delusions are a way of compensating with deep shame or a fragmented sense of self or an empty self. You feel so bad about yourself, so you concoct this delusion that is the exact opposite, that you are an idealized form of yourself. What about referential delusions? With referential delusions, it's believed that this is because psychosis causes us to have a very fuzzy boundary between the internal and the external experiences. Like when you think about very small infants, they don't know that they're separate from their moms. They don't understand where their body ends and the external world begins. So in a sense, when someone is experiencing psychosis, it's almost like they regress to that very, very, very young self, an infant self that doesn't understand that barrier between internal and external. And so even internal things, like an internal monologue, gets attributed to the external, where she thinks someone is planting thoughts in my brain, or this is Steve speaking to me. All of these delusions go back to the Freudian concept that psychosis is a way to deal with reality when you cannot accept it, when the ego is not strong enough to accept reality for what it is. It's the mind telling itself what it wishes were true, since it's not strong enough to look at what is true in the face. In this world of delusions, Hannah's body is perfection, she is accepted, she is loved, she is extraordinary, all things that she doesn't believe deep down. In the world of reality, she suffers from body image issues. She feels unloved. She doesn't feel accepted by her parents. Her self-esteem is dependent on her casting success. And in psychoanalysis, mania is seen as a defense against depression, meaning a person has this unconscious depression that sometimes mania overcompensates for and tries to shield them from. But of course, when it wears off, you are left with the depression that actually is underneath it. So that's a psychoanalytic perspective. A neurobiological perspective would say that we know bipolar disorder and psychotic disorders are highly heritable, genetic, and neurobiological. We can see a very clear pathway in the brain causing these psychotic symptoms in people. Some would argue that's really the only thing happening. It's just an organic misfiring in the brain. So we know the psychoanalytic perspective, we know a neurobiological perspective. There are also spiritual perspectives, which would say this is possession, as Steve did, or she's seeing the world for what it truly is. Some people argue it's not a coincidence that so many people experiencing psychosis report the same types of delusions, that perhaps they're all having the same type of delusions because the veil of ignorance is lifted from their psyche, and they can see reality for what it really is, and the rest of us who are not psychotic are the ones who are in denial. Which explanation is right? Hannah kind of touches on this when she asks, there was a core mystery for me at the heart of this experience. Was it magic or was I mad? The way I see things, it doesn't really matter which one you believe to be true. I don't think it's my place to tell people what meaning to make of their mental illness. Whether you believe that you are experiencing demonic possession or a neurochemical misfiring in your brain, it's the same subjective experience. The meaning you make of it is different, the explanation that you give to it is different, but the experience is exactly the same. So does it really matter what meaning someone makes of it? If a person in some faraway tribe that's never heard of science thinks of it as possession, and a person in, a Western, very science-forward society thinks that it's all just neurochemical, the experience is exactly the same. Maybe all perspectives are somewhat valid because all perspectives are just the meaning that we attribute to the same exact experience. Now, how do you differentiate between a spiritual psychosis and healthy spirituality? It's tricky because, although I hate to say it, it's difficult for people experiencing psychosis to have a healthy relationship with spirituality. Unfortunately, part of having a healthy relationship with spirituality might literally just be that you are in a lucid mental state where your spiritual beliefs don't cause you to decompensate. The only real difference between Hannah and her classmates in that spirituality class was that she was experiencing a psychotic break. Otherwise, behaviorally, they were taking part in exactly the same behaviors. Engaging in spirituality healthily means it's not becoming an obsession for you, it's not interfering with your day-to-day life, it's not taking up an excessive amount of time or energy or money, it's bringing you more positives like a sense of community rather than negatives, it's not contributing to a disordered or distorted perception of reality, it's making you more connected with people rather than isolating you, it's causing you to experience lesser grandiosity rather than more. If you can manage a healthy relationship with spirituality in all of those ways, even as someone with a psychotic disorder, then great. But if not, maintaining a healthy distance from spirituality might unfortunately be necessary for your well-being. I'm actually really curious, if you have a mental illness that predisposes you to an unhealthy relationship with spirituality, how have you navigated that? Let me know down in the comments. Now, what triggers mania? We know from research that sleep disturbances is a huge trigger for mania in people who have a predisposition for bipolar disorder. So things like jet lag, sleeplessness, working a night shift, being up with a baby, all these things are very dangerous for someone with bipolar disorder. When I was living in Chicago, my husband and I had a friend who lived down the hall who had bipolar disorder. Both us and him could hear the L going by at all hours of the night, sometimes every 30 seconds outside our windows. It was fucking awful. I felt like I was going crazy, but you can only imagine what it was like for my friend with bipolar disorder, who said for him, every time the train would come, it felt like some great calamity, some big catastrophe that was about to hit him. The sleeplessness, the sleep deprivation caused by that, no doubt in my mind, contributed to his manic episode. But in general, any sort of circadian rhythm irregularities can contribute to mania. Going to sleep and waking up at irregular hours. Even things like some forms of light therapy are not recommended for people with bipolar disorder because any sort of circadian rhythm disruptions can predispose them to mania. So we know that sleep disturbances can trigger mania, but it's also true that a low need for sleep is one of the symptoms of mania, so it's kind of hard to say which causes which. It's usually bidirectional where sleep disturbances trigger mania, but manic people already have sleep disturbances, especially when they are already manic. Of course, stress and trauma can also trigger mania. These things can trigger pretty much any type of mental health crisis or disorder. But paradoxically, when it comes to mania, elevated states or positive events can also trigger it, like getting casted in a big role, winning the lottery, getting married, perhaps because they trigger the reward system in their brain, where they get the sense of like euphoria. The pathway in their brain is already more primed for euphoria and for a sense of reward, and so it just has like a cascade of effects. Of course, substance use also can trigger mania, especially uppers like cocaine, MDMA, meth, but also things like cannabis. Even some psychotropic medications, meaning some medications that are prescribed by a psychiatrist, can trigger mania, such as ADHD stimulants or the wrong prescription of antidepressants. Childbirth is also associated with mania, surely because of the sleeplessness, but probably also because of the hormone shifts and because of the stress. Certain seasons can trigger mania, particularly spring and early summer. Remember, it's partly about the light exposure, which is crazy to think about it. It is something so biological. Maybe it's also because when people experience spring and summer, a lot of people get a sense of euphoria after the long winter. So it's possible also that it's that kind of euphoria that again has this cascade of effects. And of course, heritability. Bipolar disorder is one of the more genetic and neurobiological disorders out there. And one last thing I want to mention about mania, Hannah's experience of euphoria is one common experience of mania, but it's not how everyone experiences mania. Some people, when they are in a manic state, tend to experience more emotions of either anger or anxiety. Like sometimes manic people can be very aggressive, or sometimes they can become very overwhelmed by their racing thoughts, their inability to come down from a physiologically elevated state, which can show up a little bit more like panic. So I hope that was interesting to you in terms of learning about psychosis, mania, spiritual psychosis. Thank you so much to Hannah Murray for writing this incredibly beautiful and insightful memoir. And thank you for watching my video. Take care.
Tell me.